Going fast. But not huge, Stefan. 32. 32. Could you unshare Sophie, please? No, indeed. Yeah. I don't think we should be having an event on Ukraine without anyone from Ukraine dropped. We managed to find some people.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mick from IDS. I am here on behalf of our director, Melissa Leach, who would really have liked to have been here and shared this discussion, but I'm afraid she has an absolutely pressing other alternative. I'm not going to say it's a pleasure to be here because it's not. The conditions are not conducive to that. It is a pleasure to welcome a total of now 9 speakers, of whom 3 are here, but a special welcome to our 2 academics from the Ukraine, Ivan Zawachenko and Tina Polek, who are going to talk last, in fact. Now, before we start, I think it would be appropriate to show some recognition of what is going on in the Ukraine and to pay at least our respects both to those millions of Ukrainians who are living in fear, but equally to those many thousands of Russians who have very bravely come out on the street and demonstrated against this. I think, well, the lady from Marina Ovsyannikova, I think I've got it right, the TV editor who did that very magnificent demonstration on Russian TV. So would you mind if at least those in the room, can we have a little round of applause for all those people? Thank you. So 9 speakers, we've asked them to speak for no more than 5 minutes each, and I'm afraid we will have to be a little bit firm on that, because we would like time for questions and answers later. You can insert your questions into the Zoom chat. There is a closed captions facility on Zoom. If you wish to use it, that's a CC button from on the menu at the bottom of the screen. So let us now start. Our first speaker is Bozena Soita, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Community Research and Development, University of Wolverhampton. So Bozena, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk, and you are right, it's not that great occasion to meet and discuss things that we are about to discuss, but nevertheless, I think it's important to focus on what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and learn as much as we can, not to perhaps make any mistake in the future, but also learn from what's working well these days in Ukraine. Believe it or not, there's quite a lot of effort from the government, but also Ukrainian people into improving the current state in terms of social protection, for example. And this would be focus of my talk today. So I'd like to focus on how the Ukrainian government has adapted systems to ensure the delivery of existing social protection programs. And I would like to make quite quick 5 points due to time that we've been allocated. And my first point is that the Ukrainian government has moved with remarkable speed. We need to work to ensure that we support them to continue doing so. And this is especially in relation not only to, of course, prevent kind of Russians and military actions, but as I said, I will focus here on social protection as we do today during our meeting. So they really moved with remarkable speed. And for example, the Ministry of Social Policy put in place mechanisms to try and allow existing payments to continue, and for emergency payments to people where hostile actions were taking place. And this was done really quickly within a couple of days of invasion. And over 1 million people had registered for those payments, the new payments that they were introduced within 2 days of the invasion. So that's quite incredible. And for example, on the 10th of March, the ministry announced that it was working on a special mechanism for the payment in benefits in those regions affected by the war the most. And I think yet again, that's remarkable speed. And I think we should praise the Minister of Social Policy, but also Marina Lazebna for also direct contact with people of Ukraine to communicate those changes and those new programs, or rather new ways in which people could access social protection through radio, but also all social media through Facebook and through Twitter. And so people could access their social security rights, if you like. And this leads me to my second point, which is there are lots of good examples of flexing and adapting the system, current system from before the war to continue providing support to existing beneficiaries. And for example, one of the ways in which this was achieved, or is as we speak done, is through My Transfer, which is specific money transfer tool that allowed people, and especially those internally displaced, to access their benefits in the place where they currently reside, or they were forced to move. And this was done also remarkably, really quickly, within few days of the day of invasion. And my third point would be that much of this adaptation is possible because of changes made earlier in the system in recent years. And for example, in September 21, so not that long time ago, partly in response to delivery challenges in Eastern Ukraine, Ukraine formed the Unified Social Information System through the Ministry of Digital Transformation to develop unified social register and allow online applications for assistance. And the fact that this was in place before war played a crucial role in the way in this speed that ministry could work with during the war, because they used this unified information system in order to deliver their services to people who were internally displaced, but also to those who were left behind in places that are the most affected by war. My fourth point is that what we witnessed during the last few weeks is examples of attempts to scale up to reach new beneficiaries. So because what happened, the ministry decided that they need to enhance their social protection and include more people within their delivery system, if you like. So new funding was introduced, and this was, of course, not only through kind of social protection social security benefits existing before war, but rather through humanitarian and emergency fund and through bank accounts. And this was done to, yet again, the ministry is trying not to left behind anyone. So that was the idea behind those quick changes. And my fifth point would be that there are some challenges, and we need to, I guess, focus on that in terms of possible improvement in future during conflict, not only in Ukraine, but in other places where conflicts take place and where ministries of social protection are trying still to deliver their services to their customers, and also include others, as I've mentioned in my last point. So first, there is still limited digital inclusion in Ukraine, and this is especially in relation to elderly people. So there is issues surrounding digital literacy, and sometimes people find it difficult to access their rights online or apply for social security benefits or social protection assistance online. So this is something that it's important to highlight. But also there are questions about portability and how long people would have, those who fled, for example, to neighboring country, will be able to continue to receive their payments, let's say on their bank account. But also we need to remember that quite a lot of people in Ukraine do not use really bank accounts, but rather receive their benefits through cash, which now it's organized through this money transfer, which I spoke about a little bit earlier on. And finally, my last point, it would be that I would like to highlight what a great job the government has done during the last days, and especially in terms of the speed with which they changed their delivery system. And the fact that they also want to expand their delivery to those who were previously not receiving social security benefits or social protection assistance, rather, it's remarkable, and we need to applaud those struggles that they have to do so currently. And I'm looking forward also to hear from our Ukrainian colleagues about their perception of those points that I've raised today. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bożena. You did manage to pack an awful lot in there. Thank you. Next speaker is Paul Harvey from Humanitarian Outcomes, who is an old friend and is sitting right next to me as it happens. Paul.
Thanks, Mick. So I'm going to be building on what Bożena's saying. I've been working with her on an initial briefing on social protection systems in Ukraine as part of the Better Assistance in Crisis research program. That's a research program led by IDS, focusing on the challenges of social assistance in protracted crisis, which Ukraine isn't yet, but well, it has been since 2014, and may well become even more protracted. And so I'm just going to build on the themes we're interested in basic, we've been exploring in this brief, which is about the resilience of existing social protection systems and ways in which humanitarian actors, as crises develop, might link and think about working with them. And the theme was really brought home to me yesterday when I was talking to someone who until recently was a sort of consultant working on international social protection policies and is now been conscripted. He's a soldier in Ukraine. I was talking about these issues and he was saying he's not as worried about his young family as he would have been because they're continuing to receive child benefit payments. And he's impressed, as Bożena is, with the resilience of the system so far. The people have continued to receive things like pensions and child benefit payments. And it seems that there's huge scope to think about ways in which international actors can support those systems. Not as an alternative to humanitarian response, you need both an international humanitarian response and support to existing social protection systems. But as a complement, there certainly seems to be scope, both to enable more generous benefits. It seems an obvious thing to do would be to support the government of Ukraine to increase pension and child benefit payments. But also to strengthen the robustness of the system and to find ways to continue making payments if and when mobile and internet connectivity becomes more challenging, and to help cope with things like inflation eroding transfer values. And so whilst there is or should be huge scope for that to be part of the international response to supporting Ukraine, at least on the humanitarian side, the initial sort of feedback of people I've talked to on the humanitarian side is that those linkages aren't being made as well as they could be. That humanitarian actors are busy planning their own sort of international response through international aid agencies and aren't linking and coordinating enough with local actors and ministries. And that's really depressing because international actors since 2015 in humanitarian policy have made commitments to more direct and better funding to local actors, shorthanded as localization. They've largely failed to do it. And if they can't do it in Ukraine, you wonder if they're ever going to do it anywhere. So there's a depressing initial indications about the extent to which we're living up to commitments we've made as humanitarian actors. And then the final point, obviously, is that massive support, both humanitarian and social protection focused, is needed to Ukraine. The billions that will be needed and that in part should support existing systems can't come from existing humanitarian budgets, or you'll be robbing Peter to pay Paul. There's a funding appeal for Yemen today that's needed of 4 billion or more, and with its projections that 130,000 people in Yemen will be facing IPC phase 5, which is catastrophic food insecurity, verging on famine, by June if funding isn't forthcoming. So we need to make sure that the support that Ukraine desperately needs is additional to the support that other parts of the world also desperately need.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. The next speaker is Amrita Saha, who is a research fellow at IDS, but coming in remotely. Amrita.
Thanks, Mick. Well, economic disruption from unexpected events, such as the current war with its tragic humanitarian consequences, or even the COVID-19 pandemic, also bring in increased uncertainty for international trade, with implications for livelihoods as well as for poverty. So my sort of response today will reflect on consequences for trade and for poverty. With disruption, there are expected hits to both exports and imports flows across countries globally. There are expected increases in trade costs, and there are effects on global trade infrastructures that facilitate flows of goods, flows of services. Additionally, investment conditions also weaken when there's fear of political instability. And it is no doubt that the risk associated with that will heighten the already uncertain economic conditions that were created by COVID-19. And the cumulative of that is that there are going to be issues for international trade, for supply chains, and this will hinder the availability of goods and services globally. Now, let me make a couple of points, particularly related to what we are witnessing right now. Russia and Ukraine are important exporters of energy and food globally. When we look to Russia, Russia is a large oil and gas exporter. And in fact, Ukraine is the major transit route, or used to be, for the Russian gas that comes into Europe, for example. So one would expect rather immediate dramatic effects. However, past research on conflict and trade suggests that when there is a conflict in oil exporting nations, there may in fact only be temporary increases in prices. So the extent to which inflationary pressures as a result of the disruption here could create short-term effects or in fact lead to longer-term consequences would remain to be seen. When we look at Ukraine, although a relatively small economy in terms of global trade, it has an undoubtedly very important place in several commodities. For example, wheat, maize, and these are directly linked to food security implications. Additionally, several countries, as we are seeing right now, have placed sanctions condemning the invasion. There have been import bans, there have been export controls, etc., and these have been come into place by the United States, by UK, also the European Union. But an important question here is that what we've seen from the past experience, sanctions may often have very limited immediate effects. So it would also remain to be seen how further responses and how further reactions develop. But what would be obvious is that as a result of the sanctions, there are going to be increases in trade costs. I think in the backdrop of those sort of points in terms of disruptions to supply chains, to international trade flows, what I'd like to highlight is that the disruptions already ongoing as a result of the pandemic, there is a clear risk that is going to be heightened. There are going to be effects on global trade. The immediate risk is a hike in fuel and food prices. What we are already seeing right now, the prices of wheat are skyrocketing, and the fuel price shock could also lead to fairly dramatic effects. But I would like to sort of point out that the longer term consequences will really depend on what options as well as trade policy choices are made by countries. So while we see a fairly dramatic potential economic disruption from these actions, longer term I think there are, what has been already alluded to, it's important to make these policy choices, additionally also trade policy choices, accounting for these risks that are foreseen. I'll stop there and pass back to you, Mick. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amrita. Stephen Devereaux, also an IDS fellow and also online. Stephen.
Thank you, Mick. My inputs follow directly from Amrita's. I've been asked to talk about the implications for global food security of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the situation in Ukraine is obviously a humanitarian crisis first and foremost, and the food security and well-being of the people of Ukraine should be the immediate concern of the global community. However, because of the dominant roles of Russia and Ukraine in global food, fuel, and fertilizer markets, there are also massive knock-on effects for people around the world. In fact, there are several direct and indirect pathways from the invasion of Ukraine to potential risks to food security in other countries. Because I only have a few minutes, I'll briefly discuss 3 of these pathways. The first pathway is global food availability decline. Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe, and Russia and Ukraine have both become major food exporters in recent years. In 2020, these 2 countries accounted for 1/3 of the world's wheat trade and 1/4 of the world's barley trade. Ukraine alone exported 15% of the world's maize and half of all sunflower oil traded globally. 2 likely consequences of the ongoing crisis are reduced exports from Ukraine due to disrupted production and trade, and reduced exports from Russia due to economic sanctions. Commercial exports from major ports like Odessa have already been suspended, so there will be less wheat, maize, barley, and cooking oil available on world markets for the foreseeable future, although, as Amrita said, we're not quite sure how long this disruption will last. 50 countries depend on Russia and Ukraine for 30% or more of their wheat. Many of these are low-income food deficit countries in North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, such as Bangladesh, Egypt, Nigeria, Sudan, and Yemen, which, as Paul mentioned, is currently on the brink of famine. The second pathway to global food insecurity is rising food prices. Reduced food supplies will cause food prices to rise, of course, but food prices were already rising before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In February, the FAO food price index reached a new all-time high, partly due to recovery in global demand post-COVID-19, and partly reflecting expectations of imminent disruptions to wheat and maize exports from Russia and Ukraine. Rising oil, gas, and petrol prices will drive food price inflation even further, since food and fuel price movements tend to track each other closely. Because poor households spend a higher proportion of their income on food, higher food prices will affect low-income consumers and low-income countries worst. Bread prices are already rising in countries around the world. In poor communities of Iraq, there were protests last week following spikes in the prices of flour and cooking oil in local markets, which officials attributed to the conflict in Ukraine. The third pathway is food production declines in low-income countries. Russia is the largest global exporter of fertilizers and fertilizer ingredients such as potash, ammonia, urea, and natural gas for making nitrogen-based fertilizers. Belarus is also a major exporter of potash fertilizer. On the 2nd of March, the European Union sanctioned Belarus for supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These sanctions included a ban on all imports to Europe of potash from Belarus. Last week, Russia also suspended its exports of fertilizer, ostensibly to protect its farmers. Dozens of countries depend heavily on imports of nitrogen and potassium fertilizer from Russia and Belarus. Many of these are low-income food deficit countries in West and Central Africa. But reduced fertilizer supplies and higher fertilizer prices will also impact negatively on the middle-income and high-income countries that import large quantities of fertilizer, ranging from Brazil, India, United States, and much of Western Europe. Fertilizer prices in the US have already jumped by 10%. Food production could therefore be compromised in many countries across the world. So I want to conclude with a prognosis. How bad will it get? I think it depends on several things that are not known at this time. Firstly, how bad will the war get and how long will it last? For example, how badly will Ukrainian exports be disrupted? Will sanctions be applied against Ukrainian exports if Russia takes over running Ukraine? When will sanctions against Russia be lifted? Secondly, how high will food and energy prices rise? For how long will those prices remain high? And at what new baseline levels will they stabilize after the conflict is over? Thirdly, how resilient are global and national food systems? A resilient food system has the capacity to sustainably provide sufficient, appropriate, safe, and accessible food to all people over time, even in the face of shocks and stresses. Can households and nations afford to pay higher prices for food and energy? How quickly can households and nations diversify away from Ukraine and Russia for their food, energy, and fertilizer? And finally, what actions will governments and international agencies take to mitigate the effects? We know that governments are already scrambling to reduce their dependence on imports from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. What social protection measures will governments offer to affected farmers and consumers in their own countries? Will countries start to aim more for self-sufficiency and reduce dependence on fossil fuels and chemical fertilizers? If they do, this could be one positive side effect. As I said, we don't yet know the answers to these and related questions, but one thing is certain. Sadly, it will get worse for Ukraine and the world before it gets better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Julia Mascagni. Julia is also IDS and also Research Director at the International Center for Tax and Development. Julia.
Thanks, Mick. It's going to be a bit of a change of gear with my reflections. I'm going to talk about Russian wealth and the sanctions that are being applied to it. And I want to start with the fact about Russian wealth, which is that it is highly concentrated at the top, and a large portion of it is offshore. And we now have hard evidence on this, thanks to the work of economists like Gabriel Zuckman, Aneta Steder, Emmanuel Saez. They've been analyzing data for quite a few years now. And they've shown us, for example, that the share of offshore wealth over total wealth in Russia is much larger than in other countries like the UK, the US, France, or Spain. And equally, that wealth and income is concentrated amongst the richest 1%, a lot more than in many European countries. So in some way, this is good news, because it means that when one goes out to sanction Russian wealth, this is a relatively contained group of people, and their wealth is largely held not in Russia, where it would be a lot harder to reach it with sanctions. So where is it? That wealth, for a large part, is really in our own home. It is in places like the UK. It has been known for a long time that the UK is the haven of choice for many Russian oligarchs. And I think it is important to say that this wealth doesn't just happen to be in places like London. Places like London not only hosted it, but welcomed it, ensured protection for it, and secrecy. And this is money that, at a minimum, is of incredibly dubious nature, if not outright dirty, corrupt, and possibly laundered in the UK. So if that is true, countries like the UK and other Western countries haven't only been neutral observers in this process. They have been accomplices, and that needs to dictate the size of the response that we're now giving to the war in Ukraine when it comes to sanctions on rich Russians in particular. But also should dictate the size of the response, taking, in a way, obviously the war is never an opportunity, and this is absolutely a horrible war, and there's horrible crimes being committed in Ukraine, but it can perhaps be an opportunity to tackle a problem that is certainly a global problem and that was already there well before the war. And because it was already there before the war, it doesn't only have to do with Russia. We know that kleptocrats and their associates have been getting richer at the expense of ordinary people for many years and in many countries. So by all means, we should be treating this as a global problem, but of course with also the added urgency of its benefit, of the benefits that tackling it can have for the situation in Ukraine. So what is it that can be done? I certainly don't have time to go into the details of everything that can be done about this. I would point you to a great report by the Tax Justice Network, which I'm hoping somebody can post in the chat. The key point here on the what can be done question is that we need to know where the wealth comes from. And if it is legitimate wealth, then it needs to be taxed appropriately. If it is not legitimate, then it needs to be prosecuted. We cannot afford to have money that is not legitimate in countries like the UK without questioning it and without investigating it, which is what has been happening so far. In order to do all of that, you need to know who owns the assets and where those assets are. And this is incredibly difficult because, particularly because of secrecy jurisdictions, it's obviously a lot more complex than that. but because of secrecy jurisdictions and the kind of services they offer. That includes trust, shell companies, and the like. So the first thing to do here is certainly to lift secrecy. That can be done with things like asset registries, registries of beneficial ownership, but also in general, a lot more transparency over who is linked to those entities that are so problematic. I think it's important to say here that any national legislation is very unlikely to succeed unless it brings in those secrecy jurisdictions. And many of those are linked to the UK, for example. So you have UK Crown dependencies and overseas territories playing a very important role here. So in a way, the UK is in a really good position to actually tackle this issue as a leader if that is indeed the policy desire. But aside from addressing secrecy, one can also make use of existing data to track transactions. And one of the good things about the time we live in is that all of this data is digitized. I'm an economist, I work with this kind of data, and it can be analyzed in ways that can be useful in the current situation. For example, banking data is in principle available, and we can track the movements of money in recent weeks. If I was a Russian oligarch, I would have probably started moving my money around even before the war started, when Russian troops were amassing at the border. So by looking through the banking records, we can track down where the wealth has moved and possibly address it then with appropriate sanctions. And again, all of this can be done and should be done not only to tackle the situation in Ukraine and not only for Russian oligarchs, but for everyone who's been benefited from this secrecy. Now, I want to conclude with a question. Would any of this would help the war and the horrible situation we're witnessing in Ukraine? At a minimum, it would prevent money being used to fund the war, and that would already be a good thing. Would it swing the outcome of the war? Well, that really depends on how much political power do oligarchs actually have in influencing decisions and Putin's thinking. And I don't have an answer to that question. I also don't need to have an answer to that question, because if these measures have a good enough chance to help the war in Ukraine, and at a minimum, they wouldn't do anything to it. But also there are broader good reasons. That for me amounts to a strong case for urgent and decisive action. And I'm hoping that Western policymakers can be as effective and speedy as the Ukrainian policymakers, as Dr. Bozena has described at the beginning. So hopefully we can take some inspiration there and act very quickly on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. I'm going to follow up and say a little bit more about the things that Julia was talking about. I'll start with my friend Efe, who is Nigerian, and I was talking to Efe quite recently. And Efe said, you know, when people from Europe or the United States come to Nigeria and they start wanting to talk about corruption, I said, I have a simple answer to them. I say, why do you think so many Nigerians are corrupt? It's not because Nigerians are intrinsically corrupt. It's because you people make it possible for them to be corrupt and indeed encourage them to be corrupt. Because you make it possible for international banks, and you don't prevent international banks from spiriting the money away from Nigeria to somewhere else. And you make it possible for that money to be hidden somewhere else in the world. So Efe says, you know, you do something about that, then we can talk. And he's absolutely right. I mean, the large amount of corrupt money that Julia talked about in Russia it's a very big, Russia is exceptional, but it is a global problem. And the global problem is that there are really two key mechanisms here. One is international banks that do not do their due diligence and endlessly and continuously fail to follow the rules they have themselves and allow obviously corrupt and suspect money to go around the world. And the other one is that there are so many ways in which governments internationally allow people to keep assets in secrecy, mainly in shell companies and in trusts. So there are two key mechanisms here. We know what they are. They are very difficult to stop entirely, but it is not actually rocket science to do quite a lot about them. And there is, in fact, from this crisis, potentially a significant silver lining. because the awareness of these issues that Julia was talking about has been with us for quite some years now. It's been getting bigger and bigger. The awareness comes from many sources, including sort of people like us, like academics, researchers, campaign journalists, civil society organizations. But also, and very importantly, it comes from people who are professionally concerned with national security and military issues, because they see the extent to which this illicit money is being used by criminal gangs, by drug gangs, by terrorists and others, and is not only causing all kinds of problems overseas, but it is corrupting politics in countries like Britain. And I say that quite deliberately. The politics of Britain have been seriously corrupted by all that money that is flowing through London. So the silver lining here is that there has been a real push now to do something about this. This is on the international agenda. The Financial Action Task Force, which is a intergovernmental organization, ratcheted up its efforts within a week, in fact, of the invasion of the Ukraine. Much more is to be done, and it would be terrific if more could be done on this. Much more to say on that, but I think that is enough on this issue for now. And next speaker is Jodie Thorpe here next to me, also from IDS. Jodie.
Hi. So a disclaimer first, I don't work on conflict, I don't work on Ukraine, so I don't feel quite adequate to the moment, but I also feel really moved by what's going on and wanted to find what I could bring from my work to contribute to the debate. And I want to make a few inferences from work I've been doing on COVID-19 and the way that's been affecting economies, particularly agricultural economies in Kenya, as well as bringing in some broader reflections from other work. And I have two observations and then one slightly more philosophical question to raise. So in terms of the observations, the first is looking at the impact of global shocks such as this on value chains. And then this has been hotly debated in recent years, the degree to which COVID or other shocks like the rise of China and the press of the West to try to reduce its dependence on China is changing the way global value chains work. We've not seen a major demise so far. What we're seeing with the impact of COVID-19 on agriculture in Kenya is some evidence of a shift, however, of exporters from buying from small-scale farmers to more vertically integrated production, so more control by large Kenyan firms of agricultural production in order to both benefit the global buyers and the large exporters in terms of greater security and certainty of supply and quality. Other studies that others have done, for example, have looked at the impact of the Japanese earthquake on lead firms' behavior, and they've shown not so much that they're regionalizing or reducing their supply chains, but they're spreading across the globe to a smaller number of strategic suppliers in different places. And so the implications I take from that, from what we might see from current global trends, is new sort of opportunities, if you like, but for advanced firms in emerging economies to potentially have new opportunities in value chains and new and potentially the more equitable relationships with suppliers. But I think others will be left out in the process. And on the other hand, those other smaller suppliers, small-scale farmers, smaller enterprises may be finding opportunities in domestic and regional markets. And that's what we're seeing in the trend in Kenya as well. Now, that raises interesting questions for the future of Ukraine and what its regional market might be if that is important to the future economic development of Ukraine. Second point briefly is in the face of disruptions and shocks, we're seeing greater instances of states and businesses collaborating to try to overcome mutual constraints. This interaction invariably involves larger firms or industry associations because states don't have the capacity to deal with lots of different smaller enterprises, as well as seeing large firms as the opportunity to deliver solutions at scale. But what are the sort of broader implications? I mean, firstly, obviously, the risk of corruption, and indeed, when you have weaker governments, the risk of predatory states. So in the early history of Russia, in its transition to the post-Soviet era, I mean, that was the trend you saw of greater predation by the state and greater corruption. But in other contexts, you may see a more effective collaboration between business and state, but whether effective or not, representing the interests of larger businesses. Finally, the question that I want to pose, which I've said is more philosophical, and this is about the purpose of the economy. So what we're seeing now is a use of sanctions at an absolutely unprecedented scale. In other words, the economy becomes a weapon of war, and we're seeing a global military and economic competition again in a way that at the end of the 20th century, we thought that had gone, that global competition was economic, not military. Farrell and Newman, two political scientists, have referred to weaponized interdependence. In other words, this global interdependence that was supposed to avoid wars is now being turned and used as a line of attack. So I don't have the answers to what that means, but for me, there's two questions. One is, I do see that the economy needs to have a purpose beyond, or we need to govern economies to do more than just deliver efficiency and returns for shareholders. But what is the purpose of the economy and who should define it, or how do we define that? And whether this weaponizing of the economy will finally lead to this restructuring of global financial interactions, global value chains in a way that's been predicted before but hasn't happened.
Okay, thank you very much, Judy. Very big issues, very small amount of time. Okay, we next go to Ivan Kozachenko, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Taube Center for Advanced Studies in Social Science in Poland. Ivan, you're most welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I also have to make a caveat first. I'm a sociologist studying social media and nationalism, so my expertise not immediately in development studies. And today I want to address the role of social media leading to the current war. But before doing this, I want to raise a couple of points. First, it is Ukraine nowadays without the. Indeed, before it was addressed as the Ukraine when it was territory within different empires and other political entities. So now just Ukraine. And the second point is that I can see, and not only me, a worrying tendency to bring together the problems of Ukrainian and Ukrainian academics together with the problems of the Russian descent and Russian academics. I think these two issues shouldn't be conflated, and whether addressed within very careful manner and maybe in the future. So it's just 2 points. And in understanding what is going on, it's important to think about the role of Web 2.0. And here it's like very important work by Evgeny Morozov and his book, The Net Delusion, who pointed out that social media serve not only democracies, but autocracies. In his early study of 2008, he discovered the smear campaign against Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was writing about gulags in Russia. So this was like breaking point when Stalinism was like really reanimated within Russian society and Russian regime. Of course, it wasn't just Stalinism. There was like a so-called Soviet nostalgia. So when like people felt nostalgic for that times. And with this, we approached the Euromaidan revolution of 2013 and 14. Online debates at that time, from my research, were about economy and benefits of Ukraine integrating whether into Russian-led union or European-led union. And of course, there was also this strong appeal to this Soviet nostalgia and togetherness. And it quickly changed in the so-called Russian Spring of 2014 when Crimea was occupied, and very soon social media helped to transfer the protests and movements and counter movements into armed conflict with like full help of Russia, including Russian troll farms. I published about this. At the same time, Putin was presented as the Stalin of nowadays, as the great leader. And it was like really weaponized discourses of history. In 2017, Ukraine banned Russian social media platforms. It's effectively fragmented and divided media spaces. And within this, like different fragments, more homogeneity could be observed. In the immediate process of before the war, we could see also lots of expert social media commentaries, which actually discursively undermined the Western support. So there were claims that Ukrainians won't be fighting for this for their country, like 30% by some survey. So basically, there is no need to help and bring defensive weapons. Or, for instance, that Ukrainians are divided on the NATO membership, although it was like already consensus in Ukrainian society. So now we witness what could be called like social media iron curtain. So lots of social media platforms have been banned in Russia. Also, in a way, some restrictive measures are harsher than during Stalinist times. So it's more Orwellian in the way that you cannot call war a war. And then, like in January, a Russian teenager was handed a 5-year prison sentence for destroying the FSB, former KGB building in a computer game Minecraft. So basically, what we are witnessing, and I also like Professor Devereux conclude with some projections. So there would be a very harsh regime, probably unprecedented in human history, inside Russia. But we won't expect to troll farms and misinformation campaigns stop operating elsewhere. So still social media spaces would be polluted and divided and twisted by different state agents of Russia. And it will continue until the Putin regime is finished. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. So finally, we have Tina Polek. Tina is co-founder of the Center for Applied Anthropology. Tina, please.
Hello, everyone. So Russians started the invasion of Ukraine 3 weeks ago. From that day, everything has changed forever, not only for Ukrainians, but also to the people from the whole world. It is quite obvious now that this war is not a local conflict somewhere in the post-Soviet country in the Eastern Europe. This war is just the beginning of a global conflict with global consequences. I am an Ukrainian anthropologist. Half of my career I was working in academic sphere. During the last 4 years, I was working in NGO Center for Applied Anthropology, in non-commercial projects and as a business anthropologist in different Ukrainian companies. My academic interests were never close to the anthropology of war. Moreover, I always avoided doing researches connected to violence, trauma, and so on, because for me it was unethical to build my career on someone's pain. But now the war has come to my house, and all other topics in a moment became irrelevant and not important. It wasn't my choice, but I feel obligatory to talk about the war in Ukraine as a Ukrainian and as an anthropologist. The classical ethnography is impossible for me in these conditions because right now I'm in the village in Western Ukraine and don't have opportunity to leave it for the research reasons. Besides, anthropology needs a distance, as you know, and in-depth interviews without it are just impossible. That's why I try to focus on what I can, and I'm doing online ethnography mostly. This war is having a lot of specific features, besides the fact that it is the first big war in Europe after World War II. It is the first war in Europe that is not only offline, but also online. So I try to focus on online everyday life of Ukrainians and the culture patterns that stand behind it. There are two main online spaces people are living in during online everyday life. messengers, and social media. But observing behavior of Ukrainians there, the first thing that the researcher will notice is totally biased worldview. Ukrainians know who is their enemy and who are their heroes. This could be effectively seen in memes that reflect the changes in everyday life during the last 3 weeks. I'm always trying to talk from the insider's point of view because that helps to understand the culture as it is. So from the insider's perspective, the world became black and white, and we should take it into account while trying to understand people's behavior here. That's why the communication is divided into in-group and out-group. In-group provides support and love, and out-group hate and anger. The reason of this biased worldview is quite understandable, but I would like also to mention that it is based on a certain emotional layer. Yesterday, one of the first quantitative researches about socio-political moods of Ukrainians was published, and it shows the main emotion Ukrainians feel in this situation. It's not frustration, it's not anxiety, not fear, but anger. And it tells us a lot about the everyday life behavior. The main value of Ukrainians, according to sociological researches during the last 20 years, is family. And now every family here is in danger, so it provokes unbelievable level of aggression. I'm not able to make any theoretical conclusions right now, but I urge to take into account several things when you will be doing it. The first one is that the war in Ukraine is not just an interesting case for the research. It is not only a field. The second one, that Ukraine has its complex and complicated context that have to be taken into account, and local scholars could help you with that. The third one is that the online aspect of this war is not less important than offline. The fourth one, that Russian propaganda is not only on TV channels, but in academic papers also. And the last one, that this war is not over yet, and the world needs solidarity in every sphere to finish it. And academia is not the exception. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's probably a sign of the seriousness of the times that 9 people spoke, and they only took 2 or 3 minutes over their allotted 45 minutes. So that's a bit of useful discipline for us all, perhaps. Now, we've got a very wide range of issues here, from what is happening in Ukraine and the longer term implications, and Russia, to what are the implications for the rest of the world. I was actually, of the many things that I noted, 2 things I was struck by in particular. The first thing was, Bożena, when you were talking about the speed and flexibility with which Ukraine and the Ukrainian government has responded to this crisis, and particularly in terms of social payments, that impressed me an awful lot. Equally, at a very different level, the points that Jody made about the implications for warfare. I mean, the fact that many people have believed for a long time that countries that have a great deal of interconnection and global and economic relations tend not to fight. Clearly not true, but in this case, when they do fight, it leads to a very different type of warfare than the one that we tend to think about. And we seem to be in that situation here. So I think questions could come, or comments for anyone. It would, I think, be very good to take advantage of the fact that Bożena, Ivan, and Tina are here. So perhaps a little preference for questions to them. James, I'm going to hand over to you to deal with the questions, because you can take some online, maybe a couple online first, and then we'll ask people in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. Just remember, if you come in the room, please use the microphone. Okay. So there's a question from San Huckstep. He asked that in previous food crises, export bans have further inflamed the market. What do you think can be done to dissuade countries from banning cereal exports, especially from the conflict countries? Take another one, take 2 at a time. So Rachel Slater asks, I'm interested to hear any reflections from panelists on whether frozen Russian assets could be used to fund social protection in the Ukraine and neighboring countries for receiving refugees. ICTD have already published a blog on that, which links.
I think the first one is probably for Stephen in the first instance.
Okay, should I respond now, Mick?
Yep.
Yes. That's an interesting question. And I think that I'd like to make a slightly related point, which is that the West has been criticized for not doing enough in many ways to support Ukraine. But I think that the sanctions, which are in effect a way of banning exports from Russia, not just of food, but also fuel and other commodities, the sanctions are actually taking quite a heavy cost, economic cost and possibly political cost on Western countries. And that shouldn't be underestimated. It's very significant. But in general, you know, the idea of export bans to protect your own food supplies it has a checkered history, as you say, Sam. It's not a very successful or an effective way of dealing with problems. And in general, a resilient food system is one that has options. It has diversified sources of food. So, you know, the risks of global integration are now being clearly demonstrated. You depend on the global market, and then something like this happens, and the global market is severely disrupted, and your access to food is threatened, and fertilizer. On the other hand, if you go for self-sufficiency, localizing value chains, you could end up being very shocked by something like a small drought or a flood or a tsunami. So the risks, you're balancing risks of local versus global interdependence. And I think that probably the most effective way forward for all countries is to try and balance, diversify sources. Don't have all your eggs in one basket. Don't get all your fertilizer from one country or most of your food imports from one country. So increasing food self-sufficiency is definitely one way of going, and China is definitely heading that way, but not at the expense of reducing global interdependence and potentially causing supply and price imbalances across the world, which is what's happening at the moment. Thank you.
Shall we ask Amrita if she wants to add anything to that? Amrita?
She may be offline.
I think she had to leave.
Okay, fine. Who would like to answer the second question? Do you want to read it out again, James?
So Rachel asks, I'm interested to hear any reflections from the panelists on whether frozen Russian assets could be used to fund social protection programs in Ukraine and in neighboring countries who are receiving refugees.
Sure.
No.
Julia?
Julia, I was wondering, I put my Tuppence worth in on the chat.
But I can try to respond to that question, but I'm not quite sure I know what the answer is. So I think the complexity there is obviously that we're dealing with multiple jurisdictions and we need to work within what is allowed by the law. So I'm not a lawyer and I don't know if it would be possible to actually use the frozen assets for anything other than keeping them where they are until the legal sort of processes have done their thing. So my sense is I wouldn't hold very high hopes in terms of, you know, productive uses for those or you know, helpful uses for those assets. I think already finding them and freezing them and making sure they don't help protract the war, that would already be, I think, the major contribution to sort of help the situation in Ukraine, aside from the broader benefits that we discussed before. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer, but I wouldn't hold my breath very much on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in. I've also put something in the chat, but for those people who are here, I get it also links to another comment in the chat about the sort of dangers of differential treatment of people. I mean, it seems to me we've heard three things in the presentation from all of the panelists. One about food and fuel prices going up, leading to increasing poverty. From Bosna and myself about the assistance that's needed and how best that could be provided. And from ICTD about the billions that we could tax much better. And there's an obvious way of joining the dots there. You know, you need more assistance and there's money that could be taxed better to assist it. One of which is Russian money. But I think there's also the danger of, in multiple dimensions of problematic language and terminology around the crisis, one of which is talking about oligarchs when you're talking about Russian billionaires and talking about entrepreneurs when you're talking about American billionaires. And so I think we need to tax everyone better, especially very wealthy people, and use that to fund better assistance everywhere, including in Ukraine, and beware of the dangers of sort of special treatment, which answers Joe's point too, I think. Yes, there have been very problematic issues of racism as the crisis unfolded, in the differential treatment of refugees, the treatment of refugees stuck in Belarus and trying to get across, in the treatment of people in Ukraine who aren't Ukrainian. And whilst understanding the sort of special solidarity that people are currently feeling for Ukraine, we need to try and mobilize that in a positive sense to treat all people equally and to treat all refugees more generously, and to do it that way.
Okay. I'll just leap in with one comment, which is my instinct as a political scientist, if I were responsible for a Western government, would be to say, yes, this is my policy, because I think it's politically a very smart thing to do, but I would be very, very careful about the implementation because of the risk that Julia pointed to of really riding roughshod over the rule of law and causing more problems in the long run than the short run. But I'm sure there's a little bit of juice to be squeezed out there, and I think it will be a smart way of doing it.
More questions? So there's a question from Jo Carpenter. She thanks everyone for an interesting discussion. Without wanting to downplay the terrible situation in Ukraine of Ukrainian refugees heading west, I wonder if panelists had views on the situation of refugees who are heading east, out of separatist regions, both now and prior to the full-blown war. Somehow I find the focus on this crisis and not many other refugees crises troubling. What does the panel think about the question of whose or which refugees counts, to borrow an ideas term?
I mean, in a sense, you partly given. I was just wondering whether Ivan or Tina want to say anything on that issue.
I think maybe Ivan is a little bit closer to this topic because I can say only about what is going on here inside.
Yeah, indeed. So we witnessed the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. And yeah, in a way, it reproduces inequalities which were always there, like Western and East Europe. And yeah, here in Poland, the collective effort is amazing. Although, yeah, obviously there are some points were raised by people who were saying that during the 2015 refugee crisis, Poland didn't act exactly the same. So more global solidarity should be achieved. And also, as we know, it's very gendered migration. So people in Ukraine, men aged 18-60 cannot leave just because they could be mobilized. And so people who are coming in Poland and further in other European countries, women with children or elderly. So it's a very special category. And yeah, it's definitely lots to address and research. And now we'll see how West European countries will react, and whether this reaction would be supportive enough, whether it would be just funding Polish initiatives, or whether it would be just admitting more refugees further west. So it's lots going on, but it's I would say it's too early to clearly highlight some tendencies in terms of response. So Poland doing is a great job so far from what I can see as an ethnographer, as a sociologist. So I hope I addressed this question.
Is there any of the other speakers want to comment on that, or in fact anyone in the room wants to comment on that? Well, let me comment on it, because I mean, this is for IDS, this is a very difficult question, and it was very good that it was asked, because there is no doubt that perceived from various other parts of the world, particularly not Europe, this does seem like a rather anomalous situation where one previous or several waves of refugees, I shouldn't use waves, numbers of refugees in recent years have not been very welcome in Europe, including not in Poland. And suddenly it looks as if just because they're white, they're incredibly welcome, and a lot of, a great deal of effort is made to support them. So I think we should accept that this is, the optics of this are not that good in much of the world. I mean, I'm going to stick my neck out a bit further and say, I think I kind of understand why this reaction is so positive and strong, because it is backed with, ultimately the threat of Russian invasion. I mean, remember, Poland sees itself as potentially the next country invaded by Russia, along with Latvia, Lithuania, etc. So it's not just a response to a refugee crisis, it's a matter of solidarity in the face of a military threat. But I realize I'm in danger of looking as if I'm excusing something that looks a little bit inequitable, so I should probably stop at that moment. This is a genuinely awkward question. Anyone else want to say anything awkward about it? Yes. Yeah, okay.
You can come up to the front, please, and use the microphone.
No, just on that question, I agree that it's a very good question, and I think it does throw some uncomfortable light on how we deal with a refugee crisis. I think the answer is not simple, because it's not purely the fact that it is our neighbors in the very real sense of being part of Europe, but it's related to an issue that's been kind of pussyfooting around, that how long we talk as if this conflict is going to be over in, we don't put a date on it, but as if this is an isolated incident, whereas it has been building up it's been kind of alluded to, it's been building up for years, and that we're entering a new phase of European history, which is going to be catastrophic. And, some people see this as the beginning, as the next great conflict of the world and taking place in Europe, and that it has already begun, and that we're behaving as if it hasn't, by assuming, and there's so many hypocrisies in this, some of which have been alluded to around laundering of money and kleptocracy and so on, how the economic, the new neoliberal order has morphed into a new phase of capitalism in crises, responding to realigning somehow. But we're looking at a major new period of conflict, and we need to mobilize and respond to that. And it is happening in our backyard. Many of us have friends in Ukraine. Many of us have worked in Ukraine. So I can certainly understand, maybe like Mick, I can understand why most Europeans here have that reaction. It doesn't justify any discrimination. I think we've been terrible, and the politics of race and ethnicity and mobility over the last 10 years have been shameful, and it's all part of this broader polarization and hardening of politics. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's Jörg Edstrom from IDS, by the way.
I'm Philip. I'm a fellow at IDS in Power and Popular Politics. I also work with Paul on the BASIC project as well. I was going to ask a technical question about social assistance, but since we're doing the awkward, difficult comments now, I'll do some awkward, difficult comments. I just returned from Lebanon. I'm a specialist in the Middle East, so I spent a lot of time speaking to civil society there, my refugee friends there, so I have some insight on how people in the Middle East are thinking about these contradictions. So just to respond to that comment there, it's in our backyard. The Middle East is in our backyard. I got into an argument on Twitter where somebody claimed that the reason why their response in Europe has been so strong is because Ukraine is in Europe, it is incredibly close. I was sitting in Beirut, that's 243 kilometers from Cyprus, which is also in the European Union. North Africa is a short boat ride to Spain. The Middle East is our backyard, and these contradictions and these hypocrisies are felt very strongly. There was a comment that this is the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. That's incorrect. The Syrian refugee crisis was 6.6 million refugees. That's the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. And then there's also a strong sense that there's a hypocrisy around the way in which the British government has applied sanctions, has come down very hard, rightly so, on Russia, whilst at the same time is selling weapons and providing technical assistance and support to the Saudis while they continue to bomb essential civilian infrastructure in Yemen. So those contradictions are strong, and we should be honest about them, and we should deal with them, because it is perceived by people we work with in the global south as forms of institutionalized racism within the international humanitarian system. Thank you.
So just a quick reflection. It's not really on exactly on the points that were just made, but I was just reflecting on how this is being viewed in other parts of the world more generally, and thinking about, again, not so much this current crisis, but an effort led in part by one of our colleagues, Carlos Fortin from Chile, around the new non-aligned movement. And that was particularly with respect to kind of the trade war between the US and China. But I think that notion of looking at what's happening here in Europe from as a struggle between the West and Russia, and what is the position of other countries and the potential for non-alignment, or sort of leaving us to it while they don't fall into the replicating the Cold War dynamic, or at least those countries. I recognize there were a number of countries that were non-aligned during the Cold War, but there were several that weren't, and I think maybe a desire to avoid that this time.
Thank you. There's a couple more questions from our online audience. So this one specifically for Dr. Boneza. Really interesting to hear your reflections on social protection response to date. It will be interesting to hear your reflections on opportunities to use the current social protection response to strengthen Ukraine's social protection system in the long term. What do we need to think about or supporting earlier on in order to do so? And then there's two more questions that I might just combine into one, then more, I guess, international structural. So there's a question asking for any reflections on shifting geopolitical realities, Modi's willingness to buy Russian oil, for example, or other global south reactions like that. And I guess that could be combined with a further question from Niva Khan, who asked about the UN Security Council and Russia's veto power upon it. And the duty of care that the United Nations have potentially through a UN security force. So why don't we have those two, and then perhaps we can go to another one.
Okay, Mazena, did you get that question for you?
Yes, I think I have. I think there's quite a lot of things that could be improved, of course, but also there's lots of lessons to be learned from current situation. I think this rapid digitalization and the uptake of signing up online for in order to receive social security or social protection was amazing. And I think in a funny way, the war speeded up because people in Ukraine were taking it quite slowly. And this is due to this, as I said, perhaps being used to being delivered those benefits in different way, or in relation to this digital literacy, or rather lack thereof among especially elderly. But also the fact that now social protection is kind of taking into account a broader amount of people in Ukraine is interesting, because before war there were quite a few social groups that they were privileged in as a recipient of certain benefits. And I think now there is this desire for including more people, and especially those who are internally displaced or those who are in places that are affected by war mostly. So those are the immediate changes and improvements that potentially could be follow up kind of after war, whatever this will may be. But I think there's also perhaps lesson to be learned and improvement around how social protection is funded during conflict. And I think, Paul, perhaps you could add something about that. So this kind of distribution of maybe humanitarian aid through existing modes of delivery, that would be something interesting.
Yeah, just to quickly add, Helen, I think there's a danger of thinking about sort of social protection as a long-term thing, and we take lessons for the long term in how we should strengthen social protection systems, and humanitarian aid is a short-term thing, and that's done through WFP and UNICEF. And I think that's problematic, that there are short-term things that you could do to support the social protection system in Ukraine, and that international actors could do better in working with the Ministry of Social Policy and others to do immediately. And that might be increasing payments, it might be increasing the robustness of systems, it might be enabling payments to continue as war disrupts existing systems for payments. And so I think there's a need for both humanitarian and international development and other actors to look both short-term and long-term. Over. And we've got Dr. Kozichenko. I'm conscious we're massacring everyone's names, but
Ivan, yes, Ivan, come in on that.
Just a small follow-up, Bojan, actually the adoption, first of all, adoption internet was extremely high in Ukraine. And then the industry itself was developed. Ukraine was number 3, I think, in terms of outsource IT activities. Ukraine introduced electronic passports and this application of government services called DIA. And a lot of services were delivered, like vaccination. And then, yeah, I mean, like in terms of services available and easiness to use them, it was quite good. And it was the government was aware that this elderly category is vulnerable, and President Zelensky in January actually introduced that the program to give a smartphone for every person, I think, after 60. So not only that they improve their internet literacy, but to ensure that through this digital media, social support will reach this disadvantaged category. So I mean, like in the immediate moment before the war, it's already been quite advanced. So now we see how it's been used in different ways. So it's just my small commentary.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. No, it's about this unified social information system. And as you said, it was introduced in September 21. So it is about this elderly, but it's good to know. I didn't know about this mobile phones for elderly. That's very interesting. And I'm sure this could potentially also be so helpful now when people moved around and they can access the internet through their mobile phone, and they could potentially not afford those mobile phones beforehand, right? So that's, I'm sure, became handy now as well. So that's definitely very, very interesting. The question also remains though, and I think Paul, perhaps you can say, because all is good when internet works, but when it stops, then of course ministries, they have to have plan B in terms of how they deliver their services. And often, of course, there's this digital warfare, and I wonder what would happen if the system went down. But that's, I guess, question to ponder and perhaps prepare a plan B for the ministry.
Yeah, should we take a couple more questions? So there's one here from Natalia Williams. That's a question for Tina and Ivan. It's around the possibility of long-term implications for people in both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their family and other connections on more personal community level. As we know, a huge part of the population in both countries have strong connections with either family or friends across the borders. What would you think are the long-term implications for these being broken? How and why could we avoid this? And then I'll take one more from Dieter, who has a question for Bozena, Tina, and even again. Do you have any thoughts on the feasibility and reach of how aid providers could do so through cryptocurrencies for Ukrainians, such as the massive inflow brought by websites like Aid for Ukraine? What are your thoughts on its last mile coverage?
Maybe I could try to answer about families first. It is not the first situation in Ukraine when we have really complex relations between Ukrainian and Russian part of our families. First time we witnessed it during the Maidan, where there were two truths. One truth that was really truth, and the second truth from the Russian propaganda. And it was very difficult to communicate from those our relatives who lived in Russia and who tried to show us our life with the eyes of the Russian propaganda. And different families, they have chosen different strategies. Some of them didn't talk about the policy at all. Some of them, they just stopped this communication. Some of them just angered at each other. But in this situation nowadays, just you can't avoid these topics. And it is really hard when you see the bombs from your window to hear that these bombs are just come here from Ukrainian army. And I think that in long-term perspective, there will be just ruined family connections. I can't see any other way. And maybe in this question, I'm a little bit emotional because that is the topic that hurts a lot, because when you witness something and you hear that it is not true because someone watched this on the TV, it is a little bit strange.
And if I may to add, of course, yeah, these are valid points by Dr. Pollack. Yeah, indeed, most, like a lot of connections were severed after the Euromaidan revolution and the beginning of armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, and I agree on this differentiation of strategies of people who one category would be like actively adopting this hardcore Russian propaganda and would be defending these narratives. And other strategy would be sort of this Homo Sovieticus attitude. I'm like little man or woman. I cannot like really change a lot. I know there are lies, and but everyone is lying. Sort of, it's a bit this like locking individual in sort of this like shell of not trying to engage, not trying to be active. And of course, there is like strong overlap between social media and traditional media. So this Ovsyannikova, the lady which was commended at the beginning, she worked on the first channel of Russia. It's this channel which delivered the fake of the crucified Russian boy in the town of Slavyansk in 2014. So this fake was broadcasted that the Ukrainian fascists entered Slavyansk and crucified a Russian boy on like announcement board or something. So it was, and after these messages, which was were like adopted uncritically all over Russia, obviously it's mobilized like fighters who came to Donbass to fight Ukrainian army. So I mean, like maybe this action with the poster, it's something we have to take a note of. But people who were working there for 8 years, igniting this conflict, igniting the war, and preparing the regime and the society, the Russian society, to attack, maybe we should be a bit more cautious in sort of our reactions and immediate reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. That's very interesting. And I think there was a question about cryptocurrency and how donations of cryptocurrency for humanitarian aid could be distributed. To be honest, I'm not sure, but I do believe that state should take care of that. I don't know in practice how they could do it. Paul, maybe you have some ideas, but I think it's a great question, because I think perhaps in future there'll be more aid made through cryptocurrency, but I don't know how this could be organized, to be honest.
Actually, we have a Ministry of Digital Transformation, and Ukraine been quite advanced with cryptocurrencies, like in terms of mining and also assets as well. I don't remember the exact statistics, but definitely there is like a lot of people had quite big amounts of it. I think it will reach the categories it's intended to. It came in some news that there are like lots of bitcoins being donated.
Right.
So I think it would be handled appropriately. It won't be complicated for the Ukrainian government to do this. So
right. The question is just if this would be used for a kind of to reach existing beneficiaries at the level of payments that already existed pre-war, or they were receiving it, or could those amounts be doubled if possible, or it could be used to kind of to expand the delivery and include more people, potentially those affected by loss of jobs and all that, those who are suddenly in need of cash, in plain kind of English, if you like. But that's another question. But that's great to hear that there are modes in which this could be delivered.
I think we've got one more time for the gentleman here in the room.
Thanks a lot for the amazing session and some amazing comments. Just wanted a reflection of the panelists on the implication of ideas and the ideas regarding development, which has adopted because of this conflict. Just to exemplify the question, like for example, in the last 2 years of COVID, a lot of nations were talking about defining national security in a new paradigm as, like, for example, health infrastructure too. And a lot of people are saying that conventional warfare is a thing of the past and we should focus more on these things, or for example, nuclear non-proliferation. How do we convince countries about the same things now after this conflict, when the ideas have suddenly changed and conventional warfare and, for example, nuclear deterrence would have avoided this? So just a reflection on this.
Who want to answer that?
I can have a little go. Just on the cryptocurrency first, I don't know about the specifics of cryptocurrency, but in general, there's a tremendous tendency to overcomplicate how to get assistance to people in crisis, whether it's donating in-kind goods when cash is better, or donating through cryptocurrencies when there's existing payment systems that can be used. So I think simple is best when it comes to assistance in crisis, and that's often cash, and the easiest existing established mechanisms for getting people cash. On that last question, I guess it ties to the question about various questions about the inequities of sort of global solidarity in European responses to COVID versus its current response to Ukraine and the role of the UN. The world isn't right or fair, and that's exemplified in all sorts of ways. It's exemplified by the sort of inequities and racisms and hypocrisies of how international actors respond to different crises. It's exemplified by the toothlessness of the UN at times. It's exemplified by, what you were just asking, the current war is an example of sort of realpolitik at its most dangerous and scary, and the sort of the view of the world order that might is right and that you need to invest in militaries so that you can protect yourself or invade other countries. And there's a hope, I think, in IDS and other places that the world doesn't have to be like that and to fight against it, but it's a fight. It's not a fight. It's always a struggle to try and make the world fairer, better, and righter, and it's a struggle against that's happening in all sorts of places, including in Ukraine. And we need to, as one of the other comments said, be careful about sort of whataboutism. That whilst calling out the racisms and hypocrisies inherent in how we respond to Ukraine, that doesn't remove the need to respond properly to dreadful distress and suffering in Ukraine, as well as trying to respond to it in other parts of the world.
Okay. Let me try and give you probably a weak answer to that question. I think it's a really important question. I mean, my sense is that if one goes back some decades in development studies, development theory, we didn't want to deal with conflict and war. That was a sort of irritating thing we put on one side, and there was development. And that is less true today because many parts of the world, especially but not only the global south, have been suffering serious insecurity of various kinds for quite a long time. I don't think that's been necessarily taken on board in all development studies, but you might say that one of the possible results of this conflict is that we realize that we live in a world of pretty uniform or universal threat. The threats change, but I mean, they're pretty widespread, and that we will have to think differently. Quite what that means, thinking differently, I don't know, but I think it's a great question. I think we should, 2:30, let us conclude now. Thank you very much, especially to Bozena, Ivan, and Tina for joining us. I mean, clearly we don't yet know whether this conflict is going to change significant parts of the world in fairly radical ways, or whether we're hopefully just looking over the abyss and saying, oh, it's nasty down there, and not actually getting pushed over the abyss. So it's no surprise that we have no conclusion or consensus, but I think we had a very good discussion for which I would like to thank all the speakers and especially our outside speakers. Thank you very much. Bye everyone online. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.